Okay, well, thanks very much for that kind introduction, Brendan. It's obviously a great pleasure and an honour and privilege to receive the award this year. And just to really acknowledge from the outset that this is what I'm talking about today and the achievements over the past 10 years or so, very much a team effort, achievements from the group that I work with, my research group and collaborators. And so really this is their award as much as it is mine. Before I get started then, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people. Okay, well, today I'm going to talk about malaria, I guess no surprise there, and maternal and child health to some extent. And I guess the reason why I put the two together is that although I've worked on malaria for the past 15 years or so, it's been very much in the context of maternal and child health as a critical problem in maternal and child health, because malaria is one of the biggest killers and causes of illness in young children and is a huge problem in pregnant women. So it really fits, and when you study malaria in endemic countries, you can't really see malaria without seeing a host of other problems, whether that's nutritional, HIV, or other issues. Well, I joined the Institute in 2011, and one of the reasons I made the move to Burnet was because of its very clear, unambiguous and strong commitment to global health, and more broadly to disadvantaged and marginalised communities, both here in Australia and internationally. And I think that Burnet's really been quite unique in Australia and to some extent globally in having that very clear focus, which has been very refreshing. I think many of us are aware of the inequities in health globally, but it's useful and valuable to remind ourselves of just how big the divide is in some areas. And because I put my work in the context of maternal and child health, I've just put three parameters, three metrics there: infant mortality, mortality of children under the age of 5, and maternal mortality, which are also pretty good indicators of health status in countries or regions generally. I've put PNG, the comparison between Australia and PNG, because of our strong links to PNG and it's our closest neighbour, and also Malawi as an example of a sub-Saharan African country where I spent some time during my PhD and medical student days. And you can see immediately that there really is a dramatic divide between these metrics and the health of Australians compared to people in PNG or in sub-Saharan Africa. Gains have been made over decades, but those gains are too slow. We need to achieve those gains much more quickly. And malaria is one part of that complex picture. So this, I guess, I put this quote from Bill Gates because to a large extent it encapsulates both our dream and our aspirations, but also the challenges that we face. And he notes that when he was born, the malaria eradication campaign started, but then soon after was abandoned when it was realised that we just didn't have the tools to achieve it. In recent times, thanks to a number of global leaders, Bill Gates and Bill and Melinda Gates, other leaders have really tried to reinvigorate that dream, renew that vision of achieving malaria eradication as the end game. But we still have a lot of challenges and we don't have all the tools we need to achieve that, and I'll touch on some of those issues. I also put this because it provides a link with Frank Fenner, and obviously his key role in smallpox eradication is well known as one of humanity's greatest achievements, and that achievement has inspired so many other disease eradication and elimination efforts, and still is to a large extent a shining light that keeps us motivated that one day we might achieve that for some of the other diseases. And I was lucky enough to meet Frank when I was doing my PhD on malaria, inadvertently sat down next to him, not knowing who he was, at lunchtime, and then he proceeded to know a lot more about malaria than I did. which was disconcerting given that I thought he would know nothing about malaria. I think I just put this too, the sort of optimism in the 50s and 60s about malaria, and this is a sort of a quote, as advice given to an up-and-coming malaria researcher at the time, that malaria is about to be completely eradicated and you'll never make a career, let alone a living out of it. And sadly, that was never to be. That hasn't been the case. Malaria has continued. The burden of malaria continued from that time up until the peak, probably 10 or so years ago, and so it continues to be a major problem. And what we saw after the global eradication effort was this ongoing problem, this perennial or eternal challenge of rebound malaria. And one example that's often used is Madagascar, off the African coast, that during the 60s there was elimination probably of the Anopheles vector which transmits malaria in the highlands, but then there was re-emergence of malaria as control measures broke down. And there were massive epidemics that estimated to cause about 40,000 deaths. So this is a huge problem and it's an ongoing challenge. And that's not an isolated case. There's a series of examples in Africa where you see the elimination or intensified control programs end, and then there's rebound. Malaria escalates back up, in some cases, to levels that were higher than when the control measure or the elimination initiative started. So this is going to be our persisting challenge. Just to touch on the burden of malaria, several 100,000 deaths a year, up to 300 million cases a year. We think in the early 90s it was 1 million a year, but it seems to have dropped. Most of the deaths and disease are due to Plasmodium falciparum, with Plasmodium vivax being the second major cause and increasingly recognised. But I put that figure in bold, that WHO estimates are that malaria causes 7% of all deaths in children under the age of 5, which is staggering. And in somewhere like PNG, it's estimated to be 11%. So you can imagine the impact on global health and the health of populations if malaria was no longer part of the equation. So it is a tremendously important disease. Malaria in pregnancy is another big issue, that pregnant women are a second group at high risk of malaria, with up to 100 million pregnant women or pregnancies at risk annually. It's one of the world's most important and potentially preventable causes of low birth weight, which is associated with 90% of infant death. So it's a huge problem in itself, and it presents another challenge in malaria control. We tend to talk about the health impacts and social impacts of malaria, but we have to acknowledge that it has a much greater and broader impact, as many health conditions do, on childhood development, education, employment, and ultimately compounding the poverty cycle. So it's not just a health issue, it's a much bigger social, economic and political issue. Several leading world macroeconomists have shown quite clearly that malaria is one of the biggest impediments to economic development. And if we were to improve malaria in our regional neighbours and at least dramatically reduce it, it would be hugely beneficial for everyone, including Australia in terms of trade, although that's obviously not our motivation here. Just to recap the global burden of disease for Plasmodium falciparum, this just shows you the distribution. Obviously a huge burden in sub-Saharan Africa, really very little north of the Sahara, but also important in countries where we work, high burden of disease in PNG and parts of Indonesia, Myanmar, where 75% of malaria that occurs in the Mekong region occurs in Myanmar. So a huge issue there. And Plasmodium vivax, which has been increasingly recognised as an important cause of severe illness, deaths and chronic disease and disability. And particularly relevant to us here in Australia because of the region where we work and because of our engagement in Asia. It's a really important disease in Asia, and with very little vivax in Africa. And again, it's a big problem in places like PNG and parts of Indonesia, Myanmar and elsewhere. Fortunately, thanks to renewed global vision, much better funding, energised energising the movement and communities globally. We've seen substantial reductions in malaria globally. And just here's examples from several locations in Africa where there have been substantial reductions in the burden of malaria following the introduction of control measures or better treatments, improving access to treatment and diagnostics and so on. Not all of it's probably due to direct intervention, but a lot of it is. And in somewhere like PNG, we've seen reported great reductions in malaria prevalence in the past decade. But unfortunately, to just look at it globally, there were some sort of clear examples, and globally overall we're seeing reductions in the burden of malaria if you look at, measured in terms of number of cases and number of malaria deaths. These are all estimates because it's very hard to, we don't have a complete data set, we don't have all the cases reported, and particularly not all deaths are reported because most of them occur outside health facilities. But you can see reductions occurring in the last few years particularly, and the challenge is to maintain that and step up momentum. But there are issues in doing that, and this really highlights back to our old foe, rebound. And here's just one example from sub-Saharan Africa where the introduction of improved access, interventions, control measures, diagnostics has gradually pushed malaria cases and deaths down, and then we start to see rebound again, or they start to see rebound. And this has happened in many other locations in Africa, and rebound's been reported in some locations in Papua New Guinea recently. So it tells us that the gains in malaria control are fragile, that control interventions have to be sustained, and that's difficult to achieve. But ultimately we need other interventions, and that's where we make the case, as many do, that ultimately we need a highly effective malaria vaccine. But there are challenges to maintaining control, and maintaining those reductions or advancing them for a number of reasons, because we have limited control measures available. Those that are available are limited in their efficacy, partially effective. There's no vaccine at the moment. The most advanced vaccine, RTSS, completed phase 3 trials in African children and showed, unfortunately, only modest efficacy of 29 to 36%, depending on the age group. And again, it was only Plasmodium falciparum. It won't work against Plasmodium vivax. So it's a small part of a big problem. Drug resistance is widespread and increasing. Insecticide resistance is escalating. So, for example, treating bed nets with insecticides to reduce mosquito bites or spraying with insecticides to reduce mosquitoes is going to become less effective. And in some sites, people are reporting, alarming rates of insecticide resistance emerging. And on the background to all of that is that malaria is occurring in some of the poorest of the poor communities, in rural and remote regions where health services and infrastructure are quite limited. And there are a whole range of issues, apart from the biological ones and medical ones, around access and resources. So I would argue that a malaria vaccine is crucial for long-term control, elimination in as many countries as possible, and ultimately eradication if that's achievable. Just to highlight this issue of anti-malaria drug resistance, that the current first-line treatment for malaria are the artemisinin-based therapies, which hundreds of millions of malaria cases are dependent on these therapies every year. But now resistance is emerging seemingly quite quickly in Southeast Asia, spreading. So we've had it emerge pop up in Cambodia, spread through Thailand, now into Myanmar, and there's concerns that it will pop up in Africa, which would obviously be disastrous. So, again, I think this emphasises that, it's an urgent goal is to get a vaccine to help tackle this problem, because drug resistance is an ongoing problem that we've been dealing with for decades. The other, of course, is that vaccines have proven track record in achieving phenomenal public health gains. Of course, global eradication of smallpox, we've discussed. Elimination of polio has been achieved in most countries, and it's very close to global eradication, which would be a phenomenal achievement. There have also been dramatic reductions in the burden of a whole range of infectious diseases across the globe. It's a low-cost intervention. There are existing mechanisms for rolling it out through childhood immunisation programs, and it's generally well accepted by communities. So this sort of touches on the strategy that we're using, and I won't go into the technical details in any length. That's not really the focus of today. But just very briefly, when you're bitten by a mosquito, the mosquito injects the sporozoites, which travel within an hour or two to the liver, then infect hepatocytes and develop over about a week, and then parasites burst out of hepatocytes, enter the bloodstream and start replicating. And then they start this cycle of exponential replication in the bloodstream, and it's at that time people become unwell with malaria. Prior to that, you wouldn't know that you're infected. So that opens up two obvious strategies for vaccine targeting, and these are also stages that the immune system naturally targets, and that is vaccines targeting the sporozoites or the liver stage to block infection or clear infection, and vaccines that target the blood stage to clear those parasites out of the bloodstream and stop people getting sick. And that's the bulk of the naturally acquired human response amongst children and adults in endemic areas would be against the blood stages. There's an additional strategy, and that's called transmission blocking vaccines, that there are these specific forms of gametocytes which, when a mosquito feeds, it takes up those gametocytes and they infect mosquitoes. Then the mosquitoes subsequently go on to infect humans. So the concept is, if we can develop a vaccine that blocks the mosquito getting malaria, then that will be of great benefit for humans because it will reduce transmission. So it wouldn't directly stop someone getting sick. So this strategy would only be used in combination with other targets that stop clinical illness. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that a highly effective vaccine will need to include probably all three stages, all three approaches into a combined multi-targeting vaccine that would protect against infection, prevent clinical illness, and interrupt transmission. And then we could really have a tool that would greatly strengthen our capacity to achieve elimination and have sustained elimination for the long term. So just to point out that immunity to malaria does eventually develop in people naturally through natural exposure. So kids who are born into a malaria endemic area and live their life there, if they survive, can develop quite substantial immunity. So it's just some data from the Kenyan coast showing the number of malaria episodes per person per year with increasing age. And so over time, the incidence drops, people's risk of malaria drops, and by adulthood, quite robust immunity develops. But it takes a long time, and there's a lot of illness along the way, and a lot of kids will die along the way. So clearly, it's not optimal. What we take away from this is that it provides a strong rationale that if it occurs naturally, then a vaccine should be achievable. But we need a vaccine that essentially, in some way, perhaps reproduces naturally acquired immunity, but better still, goes further and induces a sort of immunity that's much stronger than the naturally acquired immunity. And just to note, though, that even for people who have lived in a malaria endemic area, developed immunity, when a woman becomes pregnant for the first time, then she returns to a highly susceptible state, which has disastrous consequences for the developing baby particularly. So we've had this RTSS vaccine, and you might have heard it in the news over the past year. It targets the sporozoite stage, which infects the liver. It's presented in this sort of novel vaccine platform, and it's gone through phase 3 trials. It was the only vaccine to have made that milestone, only malaria vaccine that's made that milestone. About 15,000 kids, all in Africa. And there were two age groups. They were chosen because the long-term goal will be to integrate a malaria vaccine into the existing childhood immunisation program. if you look at the efficacy, how well does the vaccine protect in the first year after completing the immunisations, the 3 immunisations, it was 31 to 56% reduction in malaria episodes, depending on the age group. Lower in the younger kids, better in the older kids. But unfortunately, over 4 years, it then dropped. And even with a booster, a fourth dose, the efficacy, the protective value, was only 26 to 36%. So while it's been, I think you'd say it's a substantial milestone, it's really clearly not what we need, not what we ultimately need, something that has a much greater efficacy and is much more long-lived, because a vaccine probably only lasts about 2 years. So for next generation vaccines, really what we're working on here from a number of angles at the Burnet, we need vaccines with a very high efficacy or protective effect, and we need them for Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax. So that vaccine, as I noted, is only for falciparum, and the development of vaccines for vivax is light years behind falciparum. We need vaccines with strong transmission blocking activity to interrupt transmission, and we need vaccines that are long-lasting. You know, a lot of the vaccines, childhood vaccines, give very long-lived immunity, tetanus and measles, polio. We need a vaccine of that sort of performance, ideally. And to achieve that, as I mentioned, we need multi-targeting vaccines, we need more ambitious approaches, and we need to develop strategies and approaches to induce really potent responses that are able to highly effectively block malaria. And this just to try to represent that concept of multi-stage targeting, that if you look at, how well do we protect against infection, protect against clinical illness, and reduce transmission just by targeting one stage or one component of the malaria infection cycle, we'll get variable efficacy or protective effect. If we combine them, then we believe that we'd get strong protective effect in all of those key criteria. So that's the concept behind what we're doing, to try to push towards these multi-component vaccines. And the priorities for vaccine development that we're working on are to define the key immune mechanisms that are protecting against malaria infection and disease, which have been poorly understood, to prioritise individual candidates, we call them, or combinations of candidate antigens, and to identify these sort of combination multi-stage vaccines that are going to have the best protective effect. We need strategies to develop, to generate potent protective immune responses in humans through immunisation. There's something which is lacking at the moment. And we need to understand how immunity is maintained and why it wanes so quickly in people who are naturally exposed to malaria. And in most of the vaccine trials to date, immunity's been relatively short-lived. It wanes a lot over the first year, and that's clearly suboptimal. We don't understand why that is. We also need to work on the development of platforms to generate these next generation vaccines and deliver them to communities, because we've got to get vaccines out as part of the current childhood immunisation umbrella, which has its weaknesses, but has achieved fantastic successes in many respects.